Everybody, today we're going to create on a cradled wood panel, but you could do the exact same project on a canvas or in your art journal. The important thing is that you take the time to feed your creative soul and to smell the roses. Speaking of roses, here's the inspiration for the page. These are roses from my backyard. And after sitting out there and taking time to smell the roses, I was inspired to create a page with roses. And I remembered that I had this Stamperia rice paper from NinnysNapkins. Now this one is huge. It measures 11 by 17. And as you can see, it looks like you almost get double the rice paper. Now this one is no longer carried, but Nicole has tons of other rice papers that have beautiful roses in them, as well as napkins, and you can use all of that. So I am just ripping the rice paper in half because I'm only going to use part of it for this project. The other part I already got planned to do on a slightly smaller project. Now, rice paper rips fairly carefully. You can use a pair of scissors to cut it. I've tried water cutting it like you've seen me do with napkins, and that I find very slow and I don't like doing it. In a minute, I'm going to show you my preferred way of cutting rice paper. It worked the fastest. Now here, this leaf, the petal or the leaf was off the page, the end of the rice paper. So I just cut up another leaf from that rice paper and pieced together a leaf of my own. So it was the same texture and pattern. Now here's the way I am going to cut my rice paper from now on. I'm going to use my cutting board and my X-Acto knife. It cut really easy and I could get all those extra bits off, and that's the way I prefer to create. So now that I have the composition done, now on the back of this wood panel on the top, I have decoupage down music paper, vintage music paper that I had in my stash. And I did this months and months ago and I obviously stopped. Now before I glue my rice paper down, I'm just knocking back some of that music note. I don't want to see all of it coming through my focal image. I'm okay with a little bit, so I'm just taking a makeup sponge and my white gesso and whiting out the area that is directly under the roses, especially the lighter rose. So now that I'm happy with that, I'm going to glue down the rice paper with my Liquitex Fluid Matte Medium. This is my preferred glue for rice paper and napkins. Dries quickly, and I'm putting lots underneath and lots on top. Don't be stingy. Now, rice paper is way more durable than napkins. In fact, I could lift this off and move it, which you would not be able to do once you wet a napkin. The napkin would become very, very fragile. Did you know that Nicole at NinnysNapkins carries rice paper and you can print your own pictures or whatever you want onto the rice paper and use that to decoupage? Check it out. So here I'm just adding more piece parts to the leaf and I'm just cutting from other parts of that rice paper. Remember, you don't have to use a napkin or rice paper exactly as it is. You can alter it and tweak it. I even cut a little branch to add to complete my composition. Now, the quote that I wanted to use goes with the inspiration, and I want to use the quote, take the time, as in take the time to smell the roses. So I thought it would be really great to put some clocks onto the background. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just decoupaging these clocks that I printed on copy paper onto the back. They're just going to hint out. Now I know I'm going vintage, so I grabbed this Raven Mosaic stencil from the Crafter's Workshop and pushing thickened gesso or extra thick gesso through the stencil. This is going to give pattern and texture, especially when I add color later on. Parts of this are really going to shine through, and I want texture. When I do a canvas or do a cradled board like this, I want a lot of interest, and you have extra space to build up that texture. I end up putting that in 3 places. Then I grab this stencil, another one that is vintage. I can't remember the name of this right now, but I will list them in the description box below. And there are links to where you can purchase stencils, be it through NinnysNapkins, Amazon, or the TCW Shopify store. They're all in below, and there's coupon codes as well. I want to put some black here. I want that to shine through. Again, I want to build interest in my background. Another stencil, I believe this one's called Layered Wallpaper. A great one if you do vintage. And I'm going right on top of some of that gesso that I pushed through that stencil. I didn't do all the stenciling before I put the rose down because I didn't want that black to peek through that rose. This is one of my favorite stamps. It is a sink liner that I've cut, and I am pushing into that thick gesso and stamping onto my wood panel. This is going to give pattern and texture. When I get it on top of where the rice paper is, I'm just very quickly using a baby wipe and removing it. You could leave it on, and I do on some parts. Personal choice. Now I also use that stamp, my sink liner, and I put the thick gesso all the way around the edge so that pattern shows up. Now I'm going to colorize, and I've got unbleached titanium and burnt umber, I believe. And I'm spreading it with a baby wipe. I don't want this to be solid coverage. I want to see those clocks. I want to see the pattern that's there. So I'm putting it on and taking it off. My goal here is to be able to see the music paper, to see the stenciling, to see the clocks, to see all those elements, because they're all going to add to the finished piece. Now this wood panel is rather large. That's why I can't get it completely in screen. So I apologize when what I'm working on isn't in view, but I tried to minimize that. So I hope you understand. So I'm adding some black on the textured areas to bring out the texture, and even the wrinkled from when I glued down the music paper shows up, and I love that. Now, while I'm liking the fact that it's bringing out the texture, I'm also starting to think that, oops, I did it again. This is getting too dark. One of the things I struggle with is working with red. It's not my go-to color, and I often question it. Here now, I want to brighten the focal image. So I'm giving it a wash and a paint over with colors similar. I'm using yellow oxide, I'm using Naples yellow, alizarin crimson, adding some white gesso, and I keep going back, adding, taking off, highlighting, shading. And a lot of that isn't on camera because it was a very long process and there's not much of interest to you. But I did want to indicate all the steps. Here I'm doing more of a wash, and then I'm highlighting, and then I'm going to be coming back and shading. Now a wash is where I've thinned the paint and I'm just darkening the color. If I'm using the paint to get a painterly effect, I'm usually mixing it with white gesso and it's more globbed on and it's adding texture. And I do a combination of both of those. The big red rose is mostly just a wash, and that paler rose off to the side and some of the buds are more paint. Here I'm using my angle brush with black acrylic paint and I'm shading. And I'm following the shading that was already there on the rice paper. What I did is I also took a picture of that rice paper before I started, and I can refer back to that picture to see where the shading is if I need any guidance. I want the focal image to stand out, so I want the shading to make this really pop. And I go back and forth. I do some shading and then I go do some highlighting. I might add more color. I look at it from across the room. It's this little dance that I do. If I get tired of an area or I don't know what to do, I go to a different part of the rice paper and work on it. So here's that rose, and it got very faded and pushed back. So now I'm adding a lot more color. And here I'm showing that I have taken a picture of it and I'm blowing it up to see exactly where the colors are. So I'm putting alizarin crimson in there and the Naples yellow with a little bit of yellow oxide, which is a deeper color, and white gesso. This is more the painterly effect. There's those clocks that I want to be able to see. And I'm just adding and shading with the alizarin crimson as well as some black in there because I want this rose to show up. It's important in my composition. Now I'm adding a little bit of color to the background. I'm taking some of the yellow oxide and rubbing it in different places. I take the alizarin crimson, and this just alludes to maybe other flowers in the background. Just a hint of color so it's not all just brown. And then I put a little bit of the green that I used in the leaves, which I believe was hooker's green. And I like that background better. But I was missing the pattern from my sink liner stamp. So I go back and I add more of it. Now this looks like a trellis in the background, and I loved that, but I was really feeling that this was very dark. It was the end of a long day and I was frustrated, and so I made a decision to just leave it. So here's where that was. It's very, very dark. I want to put the sentiment, take the time. Wasn't sure where that was. When I came back, unfortunately this was off camera. What I did is I gave this a wash with white gesso. That knocked back the dark. Then I came back, added a little bit more of the stamping, and added those colors back in the background. And I was much happier with that. I also built up that lighter rose with more paint and gesso and the alizarin crimson and Naples yellow. And here we have it. Then I decided that I'm going to stamp the sentiment with white acrylic paint and my wooden blocks on the leaves so it stands out. The reason for this is on most of my background there is texture, and that makes it hard to stamp on. Now I stamped with just ink, take the time, and then I played with my placement of the sentiment and was able to figure out the proper sizing and spacing. I dip it into the white acrylic paint and stamp on it. If you make a mistake, you can wipe it off with a baby wipe and apply it again, just like I did right there. And then I always clean the letter stamps with the baby wipe as well. And I decide, of course, I want some splatter, that the gold is going really well with the yellows that are already on this wood panel mixed media piece. And once that was dry, I came back and I decided to splatter with a little bit of black. I just needed that little pop of black just because the sides of the panel are painted black and I will be shading it black around the edges. And I just tied it all in together. I needed that little bit of contrast. So now I'm using my angle brush and I'm shading with the black acrylic paint on the roses as well as on outside of the roses to make it stand out from the background. Here I'm tweaking the shading that I've done, tweaking the highlighting that I've done, now that I'm closer to being completely done. And then here I'm shading around the outside, the edge, to frame the wood panel. And then it kind of bleeds in. I'm using a lot of water, so it bleeds into all that texture. So I go over that a couple times. And you can see there that the edges are painted black, and I've stamped that with my sink liner stamp with the gesso, so it's textured. Now here's something I don't know if anybody's ever seen me doing. I'm doing drippage, and I'm using gold. I decide I want to add a little something something at the top since I didn't put my sentiment up there. I'm putting gold paint, thinning it down, spraying it with a water bottle, and letting it drip across the top just to build more interest in it. And there we have the finished piece. I hope you like it. I hope you give some of the techniques that I've done a try. Go check out your stash. Do you have any roses? Don't forget to take time to smell the roses. Don't forget to take time to get your create on. It's good for you. Until next time, go get creative.